My older brother Jake and I had planned a weekend camping trip deep in the Appalachian wilderness. He was always the one who picked the locations, and I just went along for the adventure. This time was no different. Jake had found a remote spot far from any established campgrounds. It required a long hike to get there, which meant we would be completely alone. The place he picked was beautiful. A small clearing surrounded by towering trees, far from any roads or trails. But something felt off. There were old signs of people having been there before, little things like a rusty cooking pot, a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch, even a single hiking boot. None of it made sense. Who would leave behind a single boot in the middle of nowhere? Jake brushed it off. Probably just some careless campers. He said, "We spent the evening just relaxing, talking, and enjoying the silence." As night fell, we built a fire, its warm glow flickering against the trees. A few hours later, as we sat by the fire, I happened to glance out into the darkness beyond our campsite. That's when I saw it. A small, distant light, barely visible through the trees. A fire, maybe half a mile away. "Looks like we're not alone after all," Jake muttered. It wasn't unusual for other campers to be in the woods, but what was strange was the location. There was no clearing in that direction, just dense forest. No trails, no flat ground, nothing. Whoever was out there had chosen an incredibly inconvenient spot to set up camp. We tried not to think too much about it and eventually went to bed. The fire still smoldering as we zipped up our tent. I fell asleep easily, but sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. At first, I didn't know why, but then I realized I had to pee. I sighed, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The air was cool, and everything was quiet. As I moved a few steps away from our camp, I instinctively glanced toward the distant fire. It was still burning. I don't know why I kept staring at it, but as my eyes adjusted to the dark, I noticed something else, something in between our camp and that fire. A figure. At first, I told myself it was just a shadow, a trick of the moonlight. But as I kept looking, I saw more. There were at least a dozen of them, silhouettes standing perfectly still among the trees. Watching, I felt my body freeze. My stomach twisted into knots. They weren't moving, they weren't talking, they were just there. A wave of terror washed over me. I turned and hurried back to the tent, trying to keep my footsteps light. I hesitated for just a second before shaking Jake awake. He groggily mumbled something, annoyed, but when I whispered, "Someone's out there," his expression changed immediately. We crawled out of the tent together. But we didn't have to walk far. They had moved closer. Now, standing just at the edge of the clearing, barely illuminated by the dying firelight, were figures, silent, motionless, watching. I turned to Jake. His face had gone pale. He saw them too. I could hear his breathing, shallow and uneven. My own heart pounded in my chest. "Do we run?" I whispered. Jake hesitated for only a second before nodding. Neither of us grabbed our gear. We didn't even put out the fire. We just turned and bolted down the dark trail, sprinting as fast as we could. The entire time, I didn't dare look back. We made it to the car and sped away, our hands shaking as we fumbled with the keys. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. We reported what we saw to the local authorities, but they didn't seem too concerned. "Probably just some weird campers," they said. But I can't stop thinking about the abandoned things we saw in that clearing. And how many others might have stood where we stood, before vanishing into the night. This happened last summer. Sometime in July, I had a few days off work and decided to go camping alone by a river in western Montana. It was a spot I had been to before with friends. But this time, I wanted the solitude. The hike to get there was about 3 hours, not too difficult. Just long. I arrived in the afternoon and set up camp near the tree line. Not too close to the river but within earshot of the flowing water. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and then sat down with a beer, enjoying the peacefulness of the wilderness. As night fell, I built a fire and let my mind wander. There was something freeing about being alone in the wild. The sounds of the river and the distant hoots of owls filled the air. It should have been calming, but something felt off. A strange uneasiness settled over me. I kept glancing at the trees behind my tent, feeling like something was just beyond my vision. Every time I looked, there was nothing there. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. I chalked it up to my imagination and tried to ignore it. Hours passed. By around 11 p.m., I was just staring into the fire when I heard it, a sharp crack from somewhere in the woods. The kind of sound a heavy footstep makes when it snaps a branch. I sat up straight, heart pounding. It had come from somewhere behind my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly turned, shining it into the trees. At first, I saw nothing but thick darkness between the trunks. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Maybe it was an animal. I thought. A deer. Maybe. But something about it didn't feel right. If it had been a deer, I would have heard it moving through the brush. Instead, there was nothing, just dead silence. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I caught movement at the edge of my light. A figure. Someone was standing between the trees. I froze. The person was tall, easily over 6 feet, and completely still. Their face was hidden by shadows, but I could feel them staring at me. As soon as my flashlight landed on them, they stepped back, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't move for a few seconds, my mind racing. Who was that? How long had they been there? I stood up slowly, scanning the area with my flashlight. Nothing. I had two choices. Stay and hope it was nothing, or leave. I chose to leave. I didn't even bother packing up properly. I grabbed my keys, wallet, and backpack, and shoved everything else into my tent as fast as I could. Then I turned and walked as quickly as I dared down the trail. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me, just out of sight. It took me almost an hour to reach my car. When I got there, I jumped in, locked the doors, and turned on the headlights. I half expected to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching me, but there was nothing. I drove home that night. I've been camping since then, but I never go alone anymore. The feeling of being watched never really left me. Sometimes, when I'm out in the woods, I still get that same uneasy sensation. Like someone, somewhere, is standing just beyond the trees, silently watching. This happened in late summer of 2016. I had recently gone through a stressful few months at work and wanted some time away. So I decided on a solo camping trip. I found a secluded site about an hour from town, surrounded by dense forest, with only a small dirt road leading in and out. The campsite was empty when I arrived. There were only 3 designated spots, each with an old fire pit and a wooden bench. I picked the one furthest from the road, figuring it would give me the most privacy. After setting up my tent and gathering some firewood, I sat back, enjoying the quiet. A few hours passed, and the sun was beginning to set when I noticed something strange. Another tent, pitched at the farthest site. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I didn't see or hear anyone set it up, and no car had pulled in. I wasn't sure what to think. Maybe someone had arrived while I was off gathering wood? Or maybe they had hiked in from somewhere else? It was odd, but not necessarily alarming. As the sky darkened, I built a fire and started cooking. That's when I heard the first noise, a twig snapping, somewhere in the trees behind me. I turned quickly, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. Then, a low, deliberate whistle came from the direction of the new tent. It was slow, like someone signaling. A chill ran down my spine. I sat still, staring toward the other site. But the tent remained motionless. No one emerged, no sound of movement. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe just the wind, or some distant hiker, but I couldn't shake the unease settling in my gut. An hour later, I was finishing my meal when I heard it again. A twig snapping. This time, it was closer. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, scanning the area. That's when I saw it, just beyond the reach of my light. Half hidden behind a tree. A man. He was standing completely still, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. He wasn't moving, just staring, as if waiting for something. Then, without warning, he took a slow step backward, disappearing into the darkness. I grabbed my knife and my bear spray, my mind racing. Who was he? Why hadn't he approached my campsite like a normal camper? And why was he just standing there, watching? I turned my flashlight toward the other tent. It was gone. The tent that had appeared out of nowhere earlier, it wasn't there anymore. Just an empty patch of grass where it had been. My stomach dropped. Was he alone? Or were there more of them? I didn't wait to find out. I packed up as fast as I could, shoving my gear into my backpack, my hands shaking, as I started making my way back to my car. I kept my flashlight low, trying not to draw attention. Then, I heard it. That same, slow whistle. Closer this time. It was coming from the direction of the road. I froze. Was he waiting for me? I didn't know what to do. If I ran, I might make noise. If I stayed, I was a sitting target. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Behind a tree, barely visible in the dim light, another figure. There was more than one of them. I forced myself to move. I sprinted for my car, barely stopping to unlock it before throwing myself inside and locking the doors. My breath was coming fast, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. As I started the engine, I saw them, 2 figures standing at the edge of the tree line. Just watching me. They didn't run, didn't hide, they just stood there. I tore out of there, gravel kicking up behind me. I drove straight home, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I still don't know who they were, or what they wanted. I don't camp alone anymore. This happened a few years ago, maybe around 2015. I live in a small town surrounded by dense forests, with several campgrounds scattered within an hour's drive. I had a long weekend off from work and decided to go on a solo camping trip to unwind. I picked a small, lesser-known campground where you park in a dirt lot and choose from 3 designated spots. The site had old fire pits, rusted grills, and weathered benches, but no one else was there, so I took the spot on the far left. The walk from my car to the campsite was about 5 minutes. But the thick trees made it feel like I was deep in the wilderness. Plus, the campground itself was nearly an hour from town. After setting up my tent, I realized I had nothing to do. I thought about reading but decided to check if there was a hiking trail nearby. I walked back toward the entrance but found nothing. However, something else caught my attention. A car had appeared next to mine. It was an old, rusted-out blue sedan with no license plates. It had scratches, dents, and faded paint, as if it had been abandoned years ago. I didn't know what to make of it, but I figured the owner must have taken one of the other campsites. With no trail to explore, I returned to my spot and sat down. Not even 10 minutes passed before I heard footsteps approaching from behind. I turned to see a man walking toward me. He wasn't carrying a backpack or any camping gear, and he was staring directly at me as if he had come with a purpose. He looked to be in his late 30s but seemed older due to his unkempt appearance. His oversized flannel shirt was ripped and covered in stains, and his greasy hair stuck out from under a worn-out baseball cap. "Hey, can you help me with something real quick?" he asked. I hesitated for a second, but since I had nothing else to do, I said sure. Before I could stand up, he quickly added, "Not now, though. I'll come back when I'm ready." I nodded, confused as to why he had asked for help if he didn't need it yet. But I figured he just had to set up his campsite first. I sat and waited, expecting him to return in 10 or 15 minutes. But time passed, 30 minutes. Then an hour. The sun was setting, and I figured he must have handled whatever he needed himself. 2 hours later, I had almost forgotten about the whole thing. I had a fire going and was cooking my dinner when I heard footsteps again. This time, it was pitch dark. I turned my head toward the trail, hearing the crunch of gravel. Slowly, out of the darkness, a figure stepped into the dim light of my campfire. It was him. "Hey, you ready? I still need that help," he said. "With what?" I asked. He ignored my question. "It'll only take a minute. You don't look busy," he added with a grin. There was something off about the way he spoke, like he was forcing himself to act casual. I didn't want to go, but I had already agreed earlier. And for some reason, I felt weird about backing out. So, against my better judgment, I followed him. As we walked, it got darker. I suddenly realized he wasn't using a flashlight. Something felt wrong. "So, what exactly do you need help with?" I asked again. For a second, he slowed down like he was about to answer. But then, he kept walking. My heart started pounding. The forest around us was eerily silent. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something is about to happen. I let myself slow down, trying to put some distance between us without making it obvious. After a few steps, he turned his head slightly, noticing I had fallen back. His grin faded. He stopped walking. So did I. I watched as his hand slowly reached into his jacket. The second I saw the faint glint of metal, I bolted. I didn't even look back. I just ran. I heard him cursing behind me, his heavy boots pounding against the dirt as he chased me through the dark. My adrenaline kicked in, pushing me forward, crashing through the underbrush. After a minute, the sound of his footsteps started fading. Then, silence. I kept running until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. Thankfully, I had them in my pocket. I jumped in, locked the doors, and immediately called 911. By the time the police arrived, the blue car was gone. The man was gone. I gave them my full description of him and the car, but without a license plate or any identifying details, there wasn't much they could do. Looking back, I know exactly what almost happened. The way he approached me during the day, just to make sure I'd recognize him at night. The way he waited until it was dark. The way he ignored my questions and tried to lead me deeper into the woods. It was all calculated. I don't know if anyone else has fallen victim to his tactics, but I hope no one ever does. Since that night, I've never gone camping alone again.